good to go.
Okay. Hi, I'm Paula Courtney, and I'm going to be speaking on the evaluation and breeding of the Dwarf Hotot. I'm ARBA judge number 965. I am the past president of the American Dwarf Hotot Rabbit Club, and I've been raising and showing Dwarf Hotos for about 15 years now. So I'll start out by talking a little bit about breed character and what that means, how that applies to the Dwarf Hotot breed. Talk a little bit about the judge's perspective and first impressions, but then also talking about the breeder's perspective as well. We'll go into visualizing some of the point breakdowns and understanding the standard in more detail, as well as some of the sneaky disqualifications that can pop up in this breed. So when we hear about breed character or breed characteristics, those terms are thrown around a lot, but I wanted to take a moment to really define what this means. And so breed character is really the quality of conforming to a description of a particular breed. And so each specific rabbit breed has very unique characteristics, and the closer or more closely they follow or are in line with those characteristics, generally the higher quality the animal actually is. But this is really important in some organizations and other species of livestock, that they actually allocate points towards breed character or some type of traits that really have to do with the purpose of that animal. We don't necessarily have points specifically tied to this, but it is very important, especially when it comes to the animals that are really going to stand out in a class as a judge is going through. And so when we look at these two pictures of these rabbits that are on the screen, you can see we kind of can draw some conclusions about what might be mixed in there, but they're not following good breed character or have a lot of traits that really stand out where I can definitively say what breed that animal is. And so as judges, we sometimes run into rabbits like these, maybe at county shows or fun shows, rabbits that were kind of likely just intended to be pets at some point. Maybe they were rescues, but these rabbits really are an example of what would be poor breed character or not having good breed characteristics. On the flip side, these are just two examples, but when we look at these rabbits, it's very, very clear that the rabbit on the left is a mini lop. It really does have that mass and boldness. It has the right head shape, the right ear carriage. It's very clear that I can automatically assume that that is a mini lop rabbit. And then on the right side, it's obvious to me that this is a Blanc de Hotot. He's got good bone, the right ear carriage, the eye band, obviously, and then the white coloration. And so these are just two examples of animals that exhibit good breed character. So what makes a Dwarf Hotot stand out compared to other breeds? There's a lot of things, and I happen to think that they're incredibly unique, but I might be slightly biased. But all of these items listed here are characteristics that are specific to Dwarf Hotos or are combined what makes them that breed and what gives them their breed character. So they are supposed to be a compact dwarf breed, so they should give you that overall impression of a dwarf. Their head is described as being round from all directions, very much like a Netherland dwarf, and they're also described as having those really short, thick dwarf ears. So those two items are extremely important as far as starting to define the breed character and recognize that breed as it is. They're also a white rabbit with eye bands, which is incredibly unique. So the only color on the animal should be a ring of color around each eye. They are a small breed, so their max weight is 3 pounds, and they should have a rollback coat. So all of these items are kind of what really stands out or makes a Dwarf Hotot unique, at least in my opinion. So as an ARBA judge, and when we're talking about what makes certain animals really stand out when we're looking at a judging table or a row of animals on the table, we start to think about first impressions and how breed character comes into play and how important that really is. And so if you're looking at these 4 animals here, at least the 3 that are facing us, this is a very realistic view of what a judge might see as they start to go through a class of animals. And so before I even open up one of these coops and pull an animal out, I can already tell that there's a couple animals here that really stand out to me as having that dwarf-like appearance, that head that's really round from all directions, those nice short ears, and a round body. And so I'm automatically going to be drawn to those animals right off the bat, and wanting to give them a good close look so that I get my placings correct. The animal in the second hole from the left, you can see is much more plain about that head, lacks a lot of curvature, still has really excellent substance of ear, but they are longer ears, and that rabbit is lacking that more dwarf-like appearance. So moving into a breeder's perspective, I get asked a lot of questions about how I got started or how I prioritize what I'm working on as a breeder, because a lot of times it is different than necessarily how the standard is broken down for judging, or the priority I place on different things. And so I wanted to go into that a little bit just to give the 2 different perspectives, not only from a judging standpoint, but also as a breeder. So really where I start when I'm looking at this breed is always going to be on type, no matter what. And I tell that to everyone. There's a lot of people that have different opinions on how much you should prioritize markings on a marked breed and different things like that. But really that's up to you as a breeder, and you have to decide what is going to be your focus and what you're going to prioritize. But then I always recommend that people stick with those traits that they're trying to work on and have not only long-term goals, but the short-term goals. And the short-term goals will help you set your direction on what you're trying to improve specifically to reach that long-term goal. So this is just a breakdown of the standard, and we're going to go into this in quite a bit more detail, but you can see general type is 65 points, and within that we'll talk more about body, head, ears, but then I also want to point out that markings are also worth 15 points, the same as head and ears. So when I talk about visualizing points and the difference between a judge's perspective and a breeder's perspective, I'm sure everyone is aware that, you know, if you actually raise a certain breed, you've got a lot of insights into some of the challenges as far as how difficult it might be to get the right ear set and things like that. But you don't want to let those biases affect how you're actually seeing and judging the animals on the table. But when you're a breeder, right, you are always being mindful of what the real point breakdown is in the standard, and then what your actual short-term and long-term goals are for your herd. And so when we look at the actual standard, sometimes it's easier by looking at a picture of the back half of the rabbit and the front half. Well, Dwarf Hotos, the most individual points are actually on body at 35 points. But if you add in head, ear, and markings points together, that's actually 10 points more than the entire body is worth. So the head, ear, and markings are all worth 15 and add up to 45 points total. So a lot of people don't necessarily realize that when they're looking at Dwarf Hotos. So my personal point standard, I kind of just made this up on the fly, but this gives you an idea of how I call my herd and how I manage the animals that I'm keeping as replacements. And so I'm a firm believer that you have to build the house before you paint it, and body structure is extremely important to me. Being an animal breeder, I want to be doing what's best for the animals and making sure that with each generation, I'm not just making something that fits to a point standard that could win at a show, but is also a healthier version of what I had in the last generation. And so in order to do that, you need to be continuously improving your body type and your body structure. So I, in my mind, am always giving that the highest priority. I look at body type first, and if they don't have what I consider good body type, then they don't stay regardless of what the front end looks like. So I do, though, still give a lot of priority on head and ear because those have a lot to do with what my short-term goals have been over the past couple of years. And I'm really happy with the progression of where my herd has gone, but really working on that curvature of skull and thickness and set and shape to those ears. And in my personal opinion, I actually barely consider markings at all. I don't even necessarily consider what I'm keeping and culling based on whether they even have eye bands or not. I found in my experience that cleanliness and thickness of eye bands is very low heritability. Whether they have them or not is a little bit easier to manage as far as genotypes your rabbits, and I'll speak to that in a slide or two. But as far as my culling and keeping decisions with replacement animals, markings are extremely low priority for me. So I mentioned Dwarf Hotot genotypes, and there is a really excellent excellent article on the Dwarf Hotot website. So if anybody is interested in more detail on Dwarf Hotot genetics and markings, I strongly recommend going to the American Dwarf Hotot Rabbit Club website and checking out this article by Amy Hinkle. She did a really good job, and that's where this graphic is from as well. But basically, at a very high level overview, the Dwarf Hotot markings are produced as a combination of the broken gene and the Dutch gene. And so there's some variations between those genes, but if we know basic genetics, you've got recessive genes and dominant genes, and you can have something be homozygous broken or heterozygous broken. And this is detailed out in the writing description beneath these photos. But I think this image in general will surprise people to realize that you can actually get all 4 of these different marking variations in Dwarf Hotot litters, depending on how you're managing your genotypes. And so the top 2 variations, really, you'll only see those if you've got completely solid animals, and solid is the recessive, and so it's very it's a lot easier to avoid that by managing your genotypes overall. I really work on the realm of the bottom 2 animals that are photoed here. That's what I like to manage my herd to stay with as far as what their genotypes are going to be. I'm not saying that it's easy to do that, but if you start to do some more research and understand fully how the genetics of this breed works, you'll get better and better at managing what genotypes you're producing and figuring out what each individual rabbit is as far as a genotype based on the results of your litters. And so your success as a breeder of a marked breed, and not just Dwarf Hotos, but I'm sure this applies to others, including Dutch, for example, is really, your success is going to be based on making sure that you're taking the time to research and understand the genetics, color genetics and marking genetics of the breed that you're trying to raise. So again, you might remember some things about a Punnett square from high school science or some college genetics course, but again, very basic genetics. This is the broken gene, for example, and so the way that a Punnett square works is you would enter one parent's genotype on one side, and then over the top you'll have the other parent's genotype, and then you combine those 2 together in the 4 quadrants, and then that gives you the probability of each genotype that you might have for each individual offspring in that litter. And so based on this cross, we have an apparent that is homozygous broken or Charlie marked technically, and then you've got one that's heterozygous broken. And so in a litter, each offspring would have a 50% chance of being homozygous broken and a 50% chance or probability of being heterozygous broken. And so figuring out these Punnett squares and working with this is a really good way to not only understand colors, but you can understand the dwarf gene in general, probabilities of getting double dwarf or lethal dwarf gene babies, or peanuts we call them, and things like that. So really good information to know. Again, this is very high level, but you can go to adhrc.com for more information on that. And then the results of some of these breedings, I just threw in a picture of one of my litters so you can see what some of these broken Dutch babies look like. I often get asked if you can tell what the markings will look like on a Dwarf Hotot when they're born. And the answer is yes and no. So you can tell from these babies that are a few days old, they've got extremely intense, dark, deep colored eye bands already. You really can tell if the eye bands are going to be complete for the most part. You can tell what color they're going to be relatively quickly. You can usually tell, if they're going to be massively thick or a little bit on the thinner side. You can't always see any extra body spots, especially any spots that might appear on the ears. It's harder to see any types of skin freckles. Those can really pop up anytime. And it's also very difficult to see eye spots until the animals are around 8 weeks old. So again, the answer is kind of yes and no, but if you get some nice babies that look like this, there's definitely some hope when you first start looking into the nest boxes. So back to the Dwarf Hotot standard, I'm going to go through a whole bunch of pictures now and really do some different comparisons of different parts of the animal and talk through what makes the more exceptional specimens really stand out. So just to cover the overall standard again, how it's written, general type is 65 points. And like I mentioned earlier, the body is 35 of those points. The head is 15, the ears are 15, markings are also 15, and then fur is 10, color is 5, and condition is 5. So again, as I mentioned, body really is the one item that's worth the most points, but when you look at head, ears, and markings, those are a very significant amount of the animal just on that front end. So back to this visualization for the visual learners, just as I mentioned, 35 points in the back, half 45 on the front, and then color and fur and condition are not included in this visual. And I guess going back to that slide too, I'll talk more about ears, but the reason I do like to point this out is that it's very common in judging scenarios, but also in I hear it from new breeders a lot, is the tendency is to overemphasize the points that are actually allotted for markings because this is a marked breed. And so it's key to remember, I always explain it to people as the markings are literally only worth as much as the ears and as the head. But we often see that ears might be ignored completely in judging, or there's not as many comments on the head shape and really emphasizing that dwarf-like head as there necessarily should be. So it's very important to keep this front of mind and make sure the comments that are given and the placings take that into consideration. So just a comment on posing. We still see some inconsistencies in judging, and as a breeder, we kind of have come to expect that once in a while, but I like to explain it to people as the standard and description for posing a Dwarf Hotot is not terribly different from that of a mini lop. And so you're not supposed to be pushing the head down or raising it up. It's supposed to be in a natural position with a natural headset. You're definitely leaning more towards the side of posing these closer to, say, a Polish than you are a Netherland dwarf, which we do see sometimes. And both of these animals pictured, I wanted to show both of these pictures because they are posed slightly differently, but it's because those two rabbits do have a slightly different natural headset, where one is just a little bit higher up off the table, the other one's a little bit more relaxed. But when we're talking about posing them naturally, these are both correctly posed for this breed, but you don't want to necessarily overcredit one animal for being flat because it has a touch higher headset than the other, for example. So just some considerations. The exact writing from the standard is what is shown at the top of this screen as far as the natural headset and posing them in a natural position. So I mentioned body is 35 points. So they are a short, compact, and well-rounded animal. So something unique is that they are not supposed to be in a teardrop shape, and I've got some pictures to show this in a future slide. But they are supposed to be uniformly wide from the shoulders all the way to the hips, and that's very important. And those hindquarters are, again, supposed to be very well rounded. The top line should have a gradual curve from the ear base to the highest point over the hips. And I will say, as a breeder, the tendency that you're going to see is that if you get a super, super tall, deep rabbit, they're also going to tend to lack some curvature and lose that dwarf-like appearance to their head. And vice versa, if you get that super enormous, very, very round, dwarfy head, you'll start to get a little bit flatter. And so the key to being successful racing Dwarf Hotos is to really find that balance between. So on the flip side, I was having so much fun going through my phone, finding all of these crazy photos to include in here. But, you know, faults in general that are listed in our standard are a long neck, and that's mentioned in a couple of places. But, you know, when you pose an animal and set them up and you take your hand away, you don't really want them to all of a sudden just dip their head down and stretch it out and lay it across the table. That's kind of a sign that you've got a little bit longer of a neck, which is a fault in the Dwarf Hotot standard. Narrow shoulders are also a fault, and pinched hips. You can see in that bottom picture, that's a very narrow rabbit overall. You can see that it is pinched in that hindquarter. It's peeking a little bit too far forward or much too far forward. And it's just very long in overall body type. And a long body type is faulted pretty severely in this breed. But what you'll find on the tables, if you start to see the really long rabbits, you're going to be not only pushing over the max for senior weight, but you will also be seeing usually really long ears that are very pointed. Generally, you'll see folded ears on those rabbits, and you'll see that very long, flat head shape that's lacking a lot of curvature and roundness as well. So those rabbits naturally get faulted pretty heavily. And disqualification in this breed is the presence of a dewlap. I don't see these a terrible amount unless once in a while somebody tries to show an older brood doe. You might run into that, but be watchful of that it is a disqualification, and you most commonly find that on a senior doe. So the red here is just showing that this top rabbit is also peeking much too far forward. She's a bit narrow throughout. There's other things I don't like about her, but I didn't highlight those for the purpose of that slide. So moving forward, I mentioned the straightness of sidelines, the uniformly wide from shoulders to hips that's called for in our standard with well-rounded hindquarters. And so evaluating that from the top, both of those items can be super helpful. And I think these three photos really show exactly what that's describing. So that middle rabbit is not only very long in body, but definitely in a teardrop shape, but then also very pinched in the hindquarters. So a lot of issues going on in that middle photo. At the top, it's not necessarily a terrible rabbit. It's got some decent roundness on those hindquarters from what we can see at the top, but it is narrow through that front end. It is showing that teardrop shape that we're trying to move away from. And so the image at the bottom is really what you're looking for, with those nice straight sidelines, uniform width from shoulders to hindquarters, and well rounded and filled. That's quite a nice rabbit at the bottom. And you can see just from these lines exactly what I was describing as I went through the images. So we talked a bit about hindquarters already. I just want to reiterate the point and show some additional views. The top is really, especially the back view of that rabbit, I really like. It shows nice, well-filled hindquarters, that rabbit's well conditioned and quite good overall. That rabbit flipped upside down, you can see here, it's just another indication as you're learning to evaluate your own animals as a breeder, especially. Some things that helped me when I was a youth is just looking at the space between the hind legs and the straightness of hind legs. That can help you to tell a little bit more easily about the status of the hindquarters and the structure of that animal overall. Generally, what you'll find is the rabbits that have those pinched hindquarters or are undercut are also going to have narrow spaces between their hind legs, or they'll be V'd out quite severely. So when we talk about the head next, as I mentioned earlier, it's 15 points, and so it's pretty important. It's some substantial point allocation on this, and it is supposed to be a dwarf head, and it's a huge part of breed character for the Dwarf Hotot breed. So it is very important, but it's good to understand all the different aspects of evaluation of the head so that we're giving it proper point allocation. So it's described in the standard as being very bold, having good width between the eyes. And I've marked these up a little bit so you can see. So good width between the eyes, but also we specifically call out that muzzle and making sure that that muzzle is well filled. Generally, if you've got a pinched muzzle, your cheeks aren't going to be full enough either, and you'll be lacking curvature to that skull from the base of the ears to the nose as well. So usually if one of these things is being faulted, it ends up being a bit of a catastrophe, but understanding each aspect and what that means is very important to evaluating the shape of a proper dwarf head. And again, our standard calls for the head being attached to the body with no visible neck. So a lot of things have surprised me about the pandemic, and one of them is that this first doe survived in my barn this long undetected, but you can see here it's a drastic difference in what we just saw on that previous slide. This red line is really showing where the curvature should be as far as that brow. You can see she's lacking a ton of cheek. You can see from this photo she's completely pinched in the muzzle. And then again, I kind of mentioned some of the correlations earlier in seeing those longer rabbits, a snipier face, and then you start to get these thinner, more pointed ears. Her ears aren't terribly long. They're definitely balanced with her body, but you can see they're much more pointed and a lot thinner in substance. They're more folded than some of the other rabbits that we've seen in different photos. And so these are all a lot of times correlated together. But you can see this is a drastic difference from the head shapes that we just saw on the previous slide. And then this third guy over here really does have a tremendous body and a lot of depth, but you can see he's a bit more pointed in those ears, even though they're thick, but he does lack some curvature to that skull. He has a decent cheek and decent fullness to that muzzle from what we can see in the photo, but he does lack a bit of curvature. So I just wanted to point some of these out. We do fault any type of long or narrow head, but especially that pointed or weak muzzle where you get that really snipey head shape. Especially, I will say, we'll see more of it in does, but you can get bucks that have heads that bad as well. On a more positive note, we'll talk about ears. These are something I've worked really hard on as a breeder, and I often think that they're undervalued or overlooked from a judging perspective, but the standard does call for them to be short, well furred, and of good substance. Our ear standard is unique in itself, the way that the ears are described, but it is more close. It's a little bit closer to the standard for the Netherland dwarf than it would be for the Polish. And so we're described as needing to balance with the head and body, have good substance. And as far as the carriage and other things I'll talk about on the next couple of slides, that's a little bit closer to what the dwarf standard would describe. These second and third photo on this slide really show the ear shape that I strive for. You can see it's very, very different than what we just saw on that rabbit on the previous slide with the more pointed, thinner ears. These ears are all considered to be well furred and have very good substance. And then I just want to point out in this first image, our standard does not call for the ears necessarily to be touching, and so that is an acceptable distance between the ears as they're mounted on the head. So on this slide, I wanted to talk a bit about ear placement and carriage. So I see this a lot in the breed. Actually, probably the majority of rabbits or dwarf hotos I see have ear placement that's a bit closer to this first image than the second. And so our standard does call for an ear that's supposed to be erect and well set. They're not necessarily supposed to be touching in the middle, but they are supposed to have a erect carriage. And so we'll see a lot of rabbits in this breed that end up starting to get that carriage just slightly further back, as far back as you start to get, or the further back you start to get that ear carriage, the more likely they are to be a bit folded. This little blue doe in this first image actually does have really good substance to her ears that you can see from the image, and they're well furred, but they are positioned a bit far back on that head, making them a little bit more folded, versus this buck on the right side, where you can see he really does have a much straighter carriage to those ears, and in turn they are more open and they still have, you know, good substance, but you can see the differences there. And now that I just tore that little poor blue doe apart, we'll talk about these ears over here. And so our standard also does call for the ears to be rounded at the tips and short, well furred enough good substance, as I mentioned. But we do have a disqualification for ears over 2 3/4 inches in length. So this third rabbit in this image on the right has a lot of things going on, but certainly you can notice from the ears that there's some major carriage issues going on. You can see how thin they are. You can see they don't have enough furring. They're very folded and they're very pointed, and they're also really pushing that maximum ear length. And so things to be mindful of. I still do see rabbits out there that will look like that once in a while. We see a lot of them that look like this middle rabbit, where the ears are looking a little bit long to balance right now. They're slightly pointed, but I think what really stands out the most is that they're very thin and they're lacking a lot of that substance and furring. And so they appear to be more of that bright pink color. And then this first image, you can just see that they are a bit pointed. They're lacking kind of that correct shape and a bit of substance, but they don't necessarily have a poor carriage, and they're not necessarily overly long. They do look like they balance, and that rabbit really does have a nice head shape, etc., etc. So just some different examples, and I wanted to kind of show a variation of all the different types that we'll see as far as carriage, but there's a lot of pieces and moving parts to evaluation of ears, and I like to explain it in a lot of detail to people so that we're not just talking about substance but ignoring carriage and shape and length and all of that. So now we can talk a little bit about markings. So this is a huge part of our one of the huge characteristics of this breed. What makes them so striking, and what got me interested in them to begin with is they're entirely white coat with just these really beautiful rings of color around each eye. And so I love both of these photos because I think they are absolutely incredible examples of what a correct and as close to ideal as you can get eye band would really look like. I believe both of these rabbits were bred by Patty Percy, but they're absolutely beautiful, and the standard calls for a narrow, well-defined band of color that forms a complete outline of the eye. And so there's a lot of faults and disqualifications associated with the eye bands, but really getting them absolutely ideal like this is a bit challenging. The color is supposed to be intense and as dark as possible, and the ideal thickness is described as 2 pennies. So it's a little bit hard to I guess it's for some people that are more visual, like thinking about the thickness of 2 pennies stacked together is pretty easy for them to do. I like that we describe the eye band in a couple of different ways to help get the point across, depending on who's reading the standard and who's judging. But these images are good examples as well. And the way that I like to explain it to people is you want these to be as thick as possible without getting into that longer coat that's further out around the eye, because that's when you're going to start to see the faults in the feathering. If you get the eye bands too thin, you will notice that the eyelashes start to be white, and it's a very different appearance than having that 2 pennies thickness. But if you start to get really thin bands as well, you can almost get them so thin that you notice the pigment just on the skin around the eye, but hardly any fur is actually pigmented. And that's where you start to get into potential disqualification territory. So I wanted to show these 2 images, very, very close to ideal of what an eye band should look like on a dwarf photo. I included 4 different pictures on this slide because I wanted to try to describe all of what we explain as a fault in our standard through an image, because a lot of it is, there is some subjectivity to it. But eye bands that are extremely narrow or very wide should both be faulted. Eye bands that have drags, feathering, or white streaks. White streaks I don't see a ton. The second picture from the right with the burgundy colored carpet, that's an example of about as thin as you can get on an eye band before you start to get into that incomplete territory. You can see it's extremely thin. I can still see that there is colored fur around that front edge of the eye. But usually when you're going to have a thin band, it'll be just that front part or one part of the eye that's getting super, super thin, and it'll be a little thicker in the other parts. But that's pretty typical of what we see on a thin eye band. The other extreme is the second picture from the left there in the middle. That's a very, very thick eye. The extra fur, or kind of what looks like a fuzzy edge, it appears as a fuzzy edge. That's what happens when the eye band gets so wide that it starts to get into those longer hairs, getting into the cheek and up over that brow. And so it gets this fuzzy appearance, and that's what we really call or refer to as feathering in our standard. That is one pretty big extreme of a very thick eye band. But the first photo on the left is also another example of feathering. You can see just kind of that shading or irregularity around that front edge, and also off the back. That's also considered feathering. And then drags are noticeable jets off of the eye band, and there's another image on the next slide that almost shows it even better. But this this last photo here on the right side, down in that front corner, that's an example of what I would call a drag, where it kind of jots down a bit further than you would really ideally like it to. So we do have some disqualifications in our standard that are associated with eye bands, but there is, again, some subjectivity to this. And so I'll just say that these first 2 images here is really getting to the place where you would be justified to disqualify these for heavy feathering, which is usually the one where people have the most questions. I don't have a photo in here of an incomplete eye band, but I do have a photo of no eye band at all. This actually does happen. If they are incomplete, a lot of times it'll look just like this rabbit with maybe a thin line or a partial eye band around it in that photo on the right. But that first photo certainly is showing a massive drag off the top of the eye there, and just getting some really heavy feathering in that middle rabbit, getting into the area where these potentially could be disqualified. I certainly wouldn't argue with somebody who did, but again, that's up to the judge to decide. So I don't have a lot to say about fur in this breed, other than they do indeed have a rollback coat, and so Unfortunately, we have a ton of variability in the coat structure in this breed, and I've noticed it is very different in different parts of the country. I noticed in my own herd it's changed drastically and gotten more uniform, thankfully, over the years. But we do see a lot of variability, and I just want to point out that this is supposed to be a rollback coat. It is supposed to have good density. I think most of us that have bred rabbits for a while have a good understanding that a true rollback coat with good density does not finish as quickly or as nicely all the time as a snappy flyback coat. But if you do see some of those shorter coats that don't have a lot of density, there are some out there that are getting closer to what I would almost consider flyback. So just making sure that they do have correct coat structure is important when judging, but also especially from a breeder's standpoint, being able to recognize that and correct it in your herd. It's not uncommon that we do see a lot of variability in the structure and length of the coat. Color. So first color I'll talk about is black, and it's pretty straightforward. And it's supposed to be a rich black, as dark as possible, and the eyes are supposed to be dark brown. I'll talk more about DQs in a bit, but we do have quite a few common disqualifications that are associated with eyes. So do pay attention to them in this breed, and when you're looking at them, make sure you get a good evaluation on that color. Chocolate is an accepted variety of Dwarf Hotot, and they're shown with the blacks. It's supposed to be a rich chocolate, as dark as possible. I find a lot of times that there's a bit of confusion almost. If it's a true chocolate, it should be pretty obvious to you that it is a chocolate. Their eyes are listed as brown. A lot of times you can see a bit of a ruby cast, as is with most chocolates. But you do want to make sure that it's truly a chocolate. We don't want to have sables and things like that slipping through. So it should be very clearly a chocolate. And then as of this past Sunday, we have a new variety based on an exemplary pass from the committee. So as long as the ARBA board approves of that as a new variety, and with the printing in the DR, blues should be able to be shown very soon. And so I just wanted to add this in here, and the description of the blue band is that the color is to be a rich medium blue, and their eyes will be blue-gray. So I will go over some sneaky disqualifications, because this is a marked breed, and they certainly do have a lot of different disqualifications. And I can say, as a breeder and a judge, I definitely appreciate when judges are checking for these common disqualifications on these breeds. We as breeders don't like to be beaten by rabbits that have some of these disqualifications either. So definitely, we're always appreciating judges that do check. And then as a breeder, obviously understanding what animals you're going to keep as replacements and understanding what disqualifications they have, if you choose to use that in your program, is important so you can manage it appropriately. So our standard does call for disqualifying any rabbits that have spots of color in areas normally without pigmentation. So that includes freckles, skin spots, spots in the ears, spots on the body. I'll show some of the common locations that we see those in a moment. And then we also call to disqualify spots or marbling in the eyes and wrong eye color. So if we start out, generally, I'll kind of go through this in the order that I check them when I'm actually judging or working with my own animals. But I flip the ears forward and check behind the ears for any spots of color, but also around the edges. Some people refer to these as fly bite spots, but they're actually genetic. They're not generally caused by insects biting the ears of rabbits, but they're on the very edge of the ears, and you'll see tiny black spots. So watch for those. I showed some images of what our mismarks look like as broken Dutch rabbits. And so really, if you think about where a Dutch rabbit has color markings, that's generally where you would find any excess spots on a Dwarf Hotot. So along that spine after where the saddle potentially would have been is a pretty common area around the hip that you would find spots. You can find them on the heels, the haunches, on top of the tail. Those are a little bit less common, but you definitely want to check for that. And then definitely check the eyes for marbling and blue spots. Those are also common in the Dutch breed, and it's linked to the that marking gene. And so definitely common in Dwarf Hotots, important to check the eyes pretty closely. At the same time that you're doing that, you can be checking the eye bands for their correct width, color, and to make sure that they are complete. And then I always check the nose and lips very closely for any skin spots or freckles. They're more common than you think. And so just making sure that you're getting a good evaluation on that is important. These are photos of unfortunately all the same rabbit, but this is actually a blanc. But just for the point of showing what these skin spots look like, they can be in a variety of areas. They might just be on one nostril, in the center, on the lips, on that bottom lip. You can find pigmentation like this in any of those areas, but this is a disqualification. I mentioned the eyes and how important it is to check the eyes. We kind of get, there's almost a couple different types of spots. And so one disqualification is marbling, and I don't have a photo of that clearly here where the eye is really a blue, gray, and a brown intermixed. We get a lot of these China blue spots, which is what I refer to as what's shown in that picture on the left. And then just those tiny spots, a lot of times they're at the bottom edge of the eye around the pupil, but they really can be anywhere in that colored portion. So look for those. And then once in a while, we do get these rabbits that have an entirely blue eye. So obviously that would be a much more obvious DQ. It's quite striking. It's hard not to notice something like that, but it can be a huge variation as far as how much of the eye is blue or how much marbling you see. And then I mentioned anywhere that a Dutch might have color on its body is where you're most likely to see these spots pop up, and the hip is very common. So just a couple images of that. I added in here the website information and reference for the genetics article that I think is really important for anybody who is really serious about raising this breed. And then I just wanted to give some photo credit that I've used photos of animals that were bred by Patty, Lindsay, and Amada, and my own. And that's all that I have for the presentation. If there's any questions.
What was a memorable time that you've had with judging Dwarf Hotos at the national level?
Yeah, so I think my first convention that I ever did, this being the breed that I was able to judge, that was pretty exciting for me. And I also really enjoyed doing it because I judged the youth kids, and I mean, it was very natural for me to do this at a convention. I really enjoyed being able to look at the animals at that type of a level. Because we only show in 4 classes, it was really good practice in managing large classes while judging, and really being able to use those first impressions and breed character and identify rabbits to pull back and sort through in the second round versus what I was going to work through in the first round through no placing and things like that. But it was pretty memorable, mostly because I was able to do this breed that I've raised for so many years at my first convention, but then also because it was a youth show.